Hey guys, how you going? I wanted to do something on the Japan's experiments during World War II. So I found this allit'sinteresting.com unit 731. I'll put the links down below. This is just a general letting you know that the Nazis weren't the only ones that did this in World War II or during the wars. Inside Unit 731, World War II, Japan's Sickening Human Experiments Program by Richard Stockton. 6 of the most disturbing experiments conducted by Unit 731, the gruesome biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. Unit 731 personnel conduct a bacteriological trial upon a test subject in Nongan County of northeast China's Jilin Province, November 1940. World War II was beyond horrible for hundreds of millions of people. It's as if all the developed countries of the world had surplus rage and hate that they'd been storing up, and it all came flooding out in the war years. Out of all the areas in which World War II was fought, none were active as long as what would come to be known as the Pacific Theatre. In fact, Japan arguably started the war by attacking Manchuria in 1931 and inarguably waged war with China by invading in 1937. The disturbances and upheavals that these invasions caused shook China to its very foundations, triggered a civil war and a famine that probably killed more people than currently live in Canada and Australia combined, and lasted until the country's Soviet liberation in 1945. And out of all the outrages that Imperial Japan unleashed upon the Chinese people during this brutal occupation, and there were indeed some stunning crimes committed, even by World War II standards, probably none was as gratuitously hateful as the operations of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare unit that somehow plumbed new depths in what was already a nearly genocidal war. Despite innocent beginnings as a research and public health agency, Unit 731 eventually grew into an assembly line for weaponized diseases that, if fully deployed, could have killed everyone on Earth several times over. All this progress was, of course, built on the limitless suffering of human prisoners who were held as test subjects and walking disease incubators until Unit 731 disbanded at the end of the war. Are they sure about that? In a long list of atrocities, these 6 programs in particular stand out in the bloody history of Unit 731. Unit 731 experiments, frostbite testing. Oh dear. The frostbitten hands of a Chinese person who was taken outside in winter by Unit 731 personnel for an experiment on how to best treat frostbite. Date unspecified. Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist assigned to Unit 731, took a special interest in hypothermia. As part of Maruta's study in limb injuries, Hisato routinely submerged prisoners' limbs in a tub of water filled with ice and had them held until the arm or leg had frozen solid and a coat of ice had formed over the skin. According to one eyewitness account, the limbs made a sound like a plank of wood when struck with a cane. Hisato then tried different methods for rapid rewarming of the frozen appendage. Sometimes he did this by dousing the limb with hot water, sometimes by holding it close to an open fire, and other times by leaving the subject untreated overnight to see how long it took for the person's own blood to thaw it out. Vivisection of conscious prisoners. A Unit 731, a doctor operates on a patient that is part of a bacteriological experiment, date unspecified. Unit 731 started out as a research unit, investigating the effects of disease and injury on the fighting ability of an armed force. One element of the unit, called Maruta, took this research a little further than the usual bounds of medical ethics by observing injuries and the course of disease on living patients. At first, these patients were volunteers from the ranks of the army, but as the experiments reached the limits of what could be non-invasively observed, and as the supply of volunteers dried up, the unit turned to the study of Chinese prisoners of war and civilian prisoners. And as the concept of consent went out the window, so did the restraint of the researchers. It was around this time that Unit 731 began referring to confined research subjects as logs, or maruta in Japanese. Study methods in these experiments were barbaric. Vivisection, for example, is the practice of mutilating human bodies without anesthesia to study the operations of living systems. Thousands of men and women, mostly Chinese communist prisoners, as well as children and elderly farmers, were infected with diseases such as cholera and the plague, then had their organs removed for examination before they died in order to study the effects of the disease without decomposition that occurs after death. Subjects had limbs amputated and reattached to the other side of the body, while others had their limbs crushed or frozen or had the circulation cut off to observe the progress of gangrene. Finally, when a prisoner's body was all used up, they would typically be shot or killed by lethal injection. Though some may have been buried alive, none of the Chinese, Mongolian, Korean or Russian prisoners assigned to Unit 731 survived their confinement. Weapons tests. A Japanese soldier uses a Chinese man's body for bayonet practice near Tianjin, China, September 1937. The effectiveness of various weapons was of obvious interest to the Japanese army. To determine effectiveness, Unit 731 herded prisoners together on a firing range and blasted them from varying ranges by multiple Japanese weapons, such as the Nambu 8mm pistol, bolt-action rifles, machine guns and grenades. Wound patterns and penetration depths were then compared on the bodies of the dead and dying inmates. Bayonets, swords and knives were also studied in this way, though the prisoners were usually bound for these tests. Flamethrowers were also tested on both covered and exposed skin. In addition, gas chambers were set up at unit facilities, and test subjects exposed to nerve gas and blister agents. Heavy objects were dropped onto bound prisoners to study crush injuries. Subjects were locked up and deprived of food and water to learn how long humans could survive without them, and victims were allowed to drink only seawater or given injections of mismatched human or animal blood to study transfusions and the clotting process. Meanwhile, prolonged X-ray exposure sterilised and killed thousands of research participants, as well as inflicting horrible burns when the emitting plates were miscalibrated or held too close to the subject's nipples, genitals or faces. And to study the effects of high G forces on pilots and falling paratroopers, Unit 731 personnel loaded human beings into large centrifuges and spun them at higher and higher speeds until they lost consciousness and or died, which usually happened around the 10 to 15 Gs, though young children showed a lower tolerance for acceleration forces. That's sad. Syphilis experiments. General Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731. Venereal disease has been the bane of organised militaries since ancient Egypt, and so it stands to reason that the Japanese military would take an interest in the symptoms and treatments of syphilis. To learn what they needed to know, doctors assigned to Unit 731 infected prisoners with the disease and withheld treatment to observe the uninterrupted course of the illness. A contemporary treatment, a primitive chemotherapy agent called salvarsan, was sometimes administered over a period of months to observe the side effects, however. To ensure effective transmission of the disease, syphilitic male prisoners were ordered to rape both female and male fellow prisoners, who would then be monitored to observe the onset of the disease. If the first exposure failed to establish infection, more rapes would be arranged until it did. Oh, rape and forced pregnancy. I think this is going to make me feel sick. Unit 731's Harbin facility. Beyond just the syphilis experiments, rape became a common feature of Unit 731's experiments. For example, female prisoners of childbearing age were sometimes forcibly impregnated so that weapon and trauma experiments could be done on them. Oh. After being infected with various diseases, exposed to chemical weapons, or suffering crush injuries, bullet wounds, and shrapnel injuries, the pregnant subjects were opened up and the effects on the fetuses studied. The idea seems to have been to translate the team's findings into civilian medicine. But if Unit 731's researchers ever published these results, the papers seem not to have survived the war years. No, they were hidden. Germ warfare. Unit 731 researchers conduct bacteriological experiments with captive child subjects in Nongqing County of northeast China, Jilin Province, November 1940. The totality of Unit 731's research was in support of their larger mission, which by 1939 was to develop horrific weapons of mass destruction for use against the Chinese population and presumably American and Soviet forces if the time ever came. To this end, Unit 731 cycled through tens of thousands of prisoners at several facilities across Manchuria, which had been occupied by imperial forces for years. Inmates of these facilities were infected with several of the most lethal pathogens known to science, such as Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic and pneumonic plague, and typhus, which the Japanese hoped would spread from person to person after being deployed and to populate disputed areas. To breed the most lethal strains possible, doctors monitored patients for a rapid onset of symptoms and quick progression. Prisoners who pulled through were shot, but those who got sick as fastest were bled to death on a mortuary table, and their blood was used to transfect other prisoners, the sickest of whom would themselves be bled to transfer the most virulent strain to yet another generation. One member of Unit 731 later recalled that very sick and unresisting prisoners would be laid out on the slab so a line could be inserted into their carotid artery. When most of the blood had been siphoned off and the heart was too weak to pump any more, an officer in leather boots climbed onto the table and jumped on the victim's chest with enough force to crush the rib cage, whereupon another dollop of blood would spurt into the container. When the plague bacillus had been bred to what was felt to be a sufficiently lethal calibre, the last generation of prisoners to be infected were exposed to huge numbers of fleas, Y. pestis preferred vector of the contagion. The fleas were then packed in dust and sealed inside clay bomb castings. Japanese personnel in protective suits carry a stretcher through Yiwu, China, during Unit 731's germ warfare tests, June 1942. On October 4th, 1940, Japanese bombers deployed these casings, each loaded with 30,000 fleas that had each sucked blood from a dying prisoner, over the Chinese village of Quazhou? I can't pronounce that, guys. Of Quzhou. Witnesses to the raid recall a fine reddish dust settling on surfaces all over town, followed by a rash of painful flea bites that afflicted nearly everyone. From contemporary accounts, it is known that more than 2,000 civilians died of plague following this attack, and that another 1,000 or so died in nearby Yiwu after the plague was carried there by sick railway workers. Other attacks using anthrax killed approximately 6,000 people in the area. In August 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had both been bombed, the Soviet army had invaded Manchuria and utterly annihilated the Japanese army, and the Emperor read his infamous surrender declaration over the radio. Unit 731 was officially disbanded. Yeah, officially. Unofficially, it kept going. Its records were mostly burned, destroying any useful information the team had managed to generate in 13 years of research. Researchers mostly slipped back into civilian life in occupied Japan as if nothing had ever happened, many of them becoming prominent members of university faculty. To this day, Japan has not apologized for, and China has not forgiven, the countless atrocities Japanese forces visited upon China between 1931 and 1945. As the last witnesses to this history grow old and die, it's possible that the matter will never be addressed again. After this, look at Unit 731, read up on some more of the worst war crimes ever committed, as well as other Japanese war crimes from the World War II era. Then have a look at 4 of the most evil science experiments ever performed and find out whether or not any of the highly disturbing Nazi research actually contributed anything to medical science. Okay, guys, let me know what you think. And yeah, if you'd want to hear more about this, I'm sure there's a lot more than what we have read here. I'll put this link down below in the description. So if you would like to read it for yourself, you can. And yeah, that was pretty sickening. That made me feel a bit queasy. Seriously. Even just reading it. Especially when it came to pregnant. Oh, look, everything that was done was horrific. Everything. From all sides, from the Nazis and obviously the Japanese as well. And I don't believe it was disbanded. But I do believe they did probably slip into society. And obviously some of them became university lecturers or high up in the university. So, okay, guys, let me know what you think. And I'm still working on another video. It's going to take me a little while because I've got to get a few things put together. Okay, guys, I'll talk to you soon. Have a good one. Bye.